My friends, colleagues, and critical thinkers, let us begin with a simple but urgent question. What does it mean when the world's most advanced fighter jets, the U.S. F-35s, suddenly appear in the skies just a few miles from Venezuela's borders? Are we witnessing a necessary act of defense, or yet another chapter in the long history of U.S. interventionism dressed up as protection? Let's be clear, Venezuela is not a superpower. It does not possess an arsenal capable of threatening the United States, and yet the U.S. chooses to position one of its most expensive and lethal machines of war on Venezuela's doorstep. Now I ask you, is this protection or is this provocation? If another country, say China or Russia, deployed its fighter jets in Mexico or the Caribbean, how would Washington respond? You and I know the answer. We'd be hearing words like threat, aggression, and red line. But when the roles are reversed, suddenly it is called defense. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not defense, that is hypocrisy. The deeper question we must ask is this protection for whom? Is the deployment of these jets protecting ordinary Venezuelans, protecting democracy, protecting peace? Or is it protecting corporate interests, oil access, and a long tradition of using military muscle to secure economic gains? History shows us time and time again that U.S. foreign policy in Latin America has not been about uplifting people. It has been about controlling markets, resources, and governments. The Monroe Doctrine, the coups in Chile, Guatemala, and beyond, all justified with the language of security. Today, the same language is recycled, only the weapons have become more advanced. And let's not forget the cost. Billions of dollars spent to fly F-35s into Venezuelan skies while Americans here at home face crumbling infrastructure, unaffordable health care, and stagnant wages. So I put the question to you, whose security is really being defended, the security of the American people or the security of corporate profits? Now, I am not Nama V. I understand the rhetoric of national defense. I understand the desire to appear strong in a world of shifting alliances. But there is a profound difference between genuine defense and the projection of power. When we deploy these jets in Venezuela's backyard, we are not defending. We are provoking. We are sending a message that the United States will police the hemisphere, no matter the consequences, no matter the hypocrisy. And the cost, as always, will be borne not by the policymakers in Washington, but by ordinary people, both in Venezuela and here at home. So, in closing, let us strip away the comforting language of protection. Let us call things what they are. The presence of U.S. F-35s in Venezuelan airspace is not a shield. It is a sword. It does not bring safety. It brings risk. It does not protect democracy. It undermines it. If we truly care about security, if we truly care about democracy, then the answer does not lie in the shadow of warplanes, but in diplomacy, in respect for sovereignty, and in the hard work of cooperation rather than domination. The deployment of U.S. F-35 fighter jets near Venezuela immediately forces us to confront a pressing and unavoidable question: what is the true intent behind such a move? Is this about protecting security in the Western Hemisphere, or is it about projecting American power into a region historically treated as Washington's backyard? When the United States positions its most advanced military hardware in proximity to a country like Venezuela, one that poses no existential military threat to the United States, it cannot simply be brushed aside as routine defense. This decision speaks volumes, not only about U.S. strategy, but also about the political message being broadcast to Venezuela, to Latin America, and to the rest of the world. And so we must ask, protection for whom and against what? From the perspective of military technology, the F-35 is not just another plane. It represents billions of dollars of taxpayer investment and decades of technological development. It is a symbol of military superiority, capable of stealth, advanced targeting, and overwhelming firepower. Deploying such an aircraft near Venezuela is not akin to a routine naval patrol or a symbolic flyover. It is a statement of power, and power statements demand interpretation. Why would the United States feel the need to make such a display near a country whose military capability pales in comparison? Venezuela does not have the resources, the global reach, or the nuclear arsenal that would justify a defensive posture of this magnitude, which means the F-35s are not there because of Venezuela's strength, they are there because of Venezuela's weakness and the geopolitical significance of its territory and resources. This is where the hook truly lies. Imagine for a moment if the situation were reversed. Suppose China sent a fleet of stealth aircraft into the Caribbean, parking them just outside Miami's airspace. Suppose Russia positioned advanced jets along the U.S.-Mexico border under the pretense of protection. Would the United States shrug it off as defensive, or would Washington label it as provocation, as aggression, as an intolerable threat? The answer is obvious, and it exposes a fundamental hypocrisy in global politics. What the United States calls protection, when it acts abroad, would immediately be called provocation if done by others. This double standard is not new, but it is dangerous because it allows military escalation to be disguised as defensive caution, and when advanced aircraft like the F-35 are involved, the risks are too high to ignore. The deployment is also deeply symbolic in another way. It signals to Venezuela's leadership, and by extension to all of Latin America, that Washington remains the unchallenged authority in the hemisphere. It says, do not step out of line, do not turn too closely toward Moscow or Beijing, and do not imagine that sovereignty will protect you from American oversight. This is not the language of protection. It is the language of intimidation. It is the continuation of a doctrine that has been in place for nearly 2 centuries, from the Monroe Doctrine to the Cold War, through to today. The United States claims the hemisphere as its sphere of influence, and the F-35s are simply the latest chapter in enforcing that claim. And yet, one cannot overlook the irony. If the mission of these jets were truly about protecting Venezuelans, one would expect cooperation, dialogue, and mutual security agreements. Instead, what we see is a unilateral show of force, one that raises tensions rather than reduces them. Protection, in the truest sense, would require building trust, addressing humanitarian crises, and respecting sovereignty. But what the F-35s represent is the opposite. They are instruments of pressure, reminders of dominance, and symbols of a military-first approach to foreign policy. So again, we return to the essential question: protection or provocation? The facts on the ground, the history of U.S. interventionism, and the symbolism of deploying one of the most advanced weapons systems in the world to hover near a struggling, resource-rich nation point us toward one conclusion. These jets are not there to shield anyone from harm. They are there to send a message, and the message is clear: U.S. power will be asserted with or without justification, and always under the banner of protection. The problem is that when power masquerades as protection, it becomes far more provocative than protective, and that, in turn, sets the stage for conflicts that could otherwise have been avoided. When U.S. officials describe the deployment of F-35 fighter jets near Venezuela as an act of protection, it raises a fundamental issue that goes beyond military maneuvers, the glaring hypocrisy in foreign policy. Words like protection and security sound reassuring, almost noble, yet they mask an uncomfortable truth: that the standards applied by Washington abroad are not the same ones it demands when the roles are reversed. The United States claims the right to position advanced military assets close to other nations' borders, but when other powers so much as contemplate similar actions, the U.S. narrative immediately shifts to words like threat, provocation, and hostility. This inconsistency is not just rhetorical, it reflects a double standard that shapes global politics and fuels mistrust across continents. Consider the scenario: if Russian fighter jets were stationed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, the United States would treat it as a crisis. If Chinese stealth aircraft patrolled the skies above Mexico, the rhetoric from Washington would be explosive, with words like unacceptable aggression dominating every news headline. Yet when American F-35s circle near Venezuelan airspace, it is calmly framed as defensive, as protective, as a simple matter of keeping the hemisphere safe. The hypocrisy could not be clearer, and it is this double standard that erodes America's moral credibility in the eyes of the world. Protection, it seems, is a privilege Washington reserves for itself, while others are denied the same logic. The hook is sharp here. Imagine a neighbor who insists on installing cameras pointed directly at your backyard, claiming it is for their safety, not yours. If you tried the same, they would accuse you of trespassing, even aggression. This imbalance creates not safety but suspicion. And that suspicion, when magnified on a global scale with nuclear-armed states watching closely, becomes a recipe for geopolitical instability. What the U.S. calls defense, others see as provocation. The labels change depending on who controls the narrative, but the actions remain the same. Military power asserting itself where diplomacy could have sufficed. History provides abundant examples of this hypocrisy. During the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis was not sparked by Soviet troops invading U.S. territory, but by Soviet missiles stationed in Cuba. Washington could not tolerate a rival's weapons so close to its borders, and the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Yet today, the United States justifies its own advanced weapons near the borders of countries like Venezuela or Russia, dismissing their objections as irrational. The same behavior that once nearly caused catastrophe is now practiced with confidence, under the guise of maintaining order. How long can such double standards go unchallenged before the cycle repeats itself? There is also the domestic layer to this hypocrisy. American leaders speak of protecting democracy abroad, but at home millions of citizens struggle with economic inequality, unaffordable health care, and failing infrastructure. If protection were truly the guiding principle, one would expect that those billions invested in stealth fighters might first address the insecurity felt by citizens living paycheck to paycheck. Instead, the rhetoric of protection is deployed outward, turned into a tool of foreign policy, while real protection at home remains underfunded and out of reach. The contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. This duplicity is not only transparent to adversaries but also to allies. Nations in Latin America and beyond can see the inconsistency of Washington's language. They know that protection often disguises intervention and that defense often translates into economic or political leverage. Each time the United States claims a special right to act in ways it would never tolerate from others, its global influence erodes. Allies grow wary, adversaries grow bolder, and the cycle of mistrust deepens. The uncomfortable truth is that protection and provocation are not opposites in U.S. foreign policy. They are two sides of the same coin, flipped according to convenience. The U.S. portrays itself as a guardian of peace, but when its own standards are applied universally, its actions begin to look much more like provocation than protection. The hypocrisy is not accidental, it is strategic. By controlling the narrative, Washington maintains its ability to act without being held to the same moral or diplomatic standards it demands from others, and therein lies the danger. When one nation exempts itself from the rules it expects others to follow, it invites not stability but retaliation. The question that lingers beneath the surface of the U.S. deployment of F-35s near Venezuela is deceptively simple yet profoundly revealing. Protection for whom? The language of defense, safety, and security often sounds universal, as though it encompasses all people equally. But in practice, those protected by such actions are rarely ordinary citizens. Instead, the shield of military might is more often extended over corporate interests, resource access, and geopolitical dominance, while the lives of ordinary Venezuelans, and even ordinary Americans, are left untouched or further endangered. When we peel back the rhetoric, the protective veil looks far more like a cloak designed to conceal economic motives than a banner of humanitarian concern. Let us take Venezuela itself. The country is not simply another point on the map. It is a nation endowed with some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Energy resources are, and have long been, the lifeblood of geopolitical strategy. Throughout the 20th century, U.S. foreign policy repeatedly intervened in regions rich with oil under the pretense of security. Iraq, Iran, and Libya provide stark examples of how protection rhetoric often coincides with resource interest. Venezuela fits that pattern seamlessly. It is hard to imagine that the deployment of billions of dollars in aviation technology such as the F-35 is about safeguarding democracy when democracy itself has been inconsistently supported across Latin America depending on whether it aligned with U.S. business and political objectives. The jets, therefore, appear less as protectors of Venezuelan people and more as guardians of strategic economic stakes. Here lies a striking hook. Imagine a firefighter who only responds to calls when the burning building contains valuable property, while ignoring fires in ordinary homes. Would we truly call that firefighter a protector, or would we begin to see that their service is conditional, tied not to the safety of people but to the preservation of assets? The deployment of U.S. jets sends a similar message. Where there are resources, protection suddenly becomes urgent. Where there are none, the cries for aid and safety often go unanswered. Protection becomes selective, and selective protection is not protection at all, it is strategy. The consequences of this reality for Venezuelans are significant. Ordinary citizens, struggling with inflation, shortages, and political instability, do not find relief when foreign fighter jets circle their skies. Their lives do not become safer, their children do not eat better meals, their hospitals do not receive more medicine. On the contrary, the presence of such jets raises tensions, risks confrontation, and often deepens the isolation that exacerbates humanitarian crises. Protection for them would look very different. It would mean medical cooperation, economic stabilization, and respect for their sovereignty. Yet these are not the priorities advanced by the roar of F-35 engines. Instead, the jets protect a narrative that the United States has the right and the responsibility to secure access and influence in regions where it has long intervened. Meanwhile, for the American people themselves, the question of protection is equally troubling. Billions spent to fly these machines near Venezuela do not shield U.S. citizens from the everyday threats they face at home. The healthcare system leaves millions vulnerable, the economy leaves countless families in insecurity, and climate disasters expose inadequate infrastructure. If national security were truly about protecting people, then surely the resources poured into military projection abroad would be directed first to addressing these vulnerabilities. But the priorities reveal themselves. Protection is not about citizens, but about preserving global economic interests. This duplicity becomes even more stark when compared to other global situations. Humanitarian crises in nations without oil reserves or strategic positions often fail to inspire similar military concern. There is no fleet of F-35s dispatched to protect the starving populations of forgotten conflicts. There is no emergency intervention when lives are at stake but resources are absent. The inconsistency is glaring, and it underscores that protection in this context is less about people and more about profit. And so when the U.S. frames the presence of F-35s near Venezuela as protection, the world is left to ask who exactly is being protected. The people on the ground see none of it. The only ones truly insulated are the economic interests and strategic calculations of those in power. The irony is painful. What is presented as defense becomes, for ordinary people, another form of insecurity. The shield is raised, but only over the assets that matter to the powerful. The rest are left to bear the weight of the consequences. The sight of American F-35s deployed near Venezuela is not an isolated incident, but part of a long and well-documented historical pattern. For generations, the United States has treated Latin America as its sphere of influence, often using the rhetoric of security to justify actions that in reality amounted to intervention, destabilization, or outright control. This latest move fits neatly into that history, reminding us that when Washington speaks of protection, it frequently means something far different in practice. To see the present clearly, we must recognize how the past continues to shape it. Latin America's story with U.S. intervention stretches back at least to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which essentially declared that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to European powers, and by implication, belonged under U.S. oversight. What began as a policy of deterring European colonialism soon transformed into a license for U.S. dominance. Across the 20th century, the doctrine was repeatedly invoked to justify interventions in countries whose governments, economies, or political movements threatened to diverge from Washington's preferences. Venezuela today is not the first to experience this pattern. It is simply the latest in a long line of nations confronted with the same narrative of security, masking a pursuit of influence. The hook becomes sharper when we recall specific examples. In 1954, the U.S. orchestrated a coup in Guatemala, overthrowing a democratically elected leader who dared to challenge the interests of an American corporation, the United Fruit Company. In 1973, Chile's President Salvador Allende was deposed with U.S. support because his policies leaned toward socialism and away from U.S. corporate and political priorities. Again and again, Washington justified its involvement with language about stopping communism or defending freedom. But the outcomes were the same: the installation of regimes more compliant to U.S. business interests, regardless of the democratic will of the people. When viewed in this historical light, the deployment of fighter jets near Venezuela is not an anomaly, it is a continuation. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Just as in Chile or Guatemala, Venezuela's challenge lies not in its capacity to threaten U.S. security, but in its pursuit of policies and alliances that do not align with Washington's vision. Caracas has maintained relationships with Russia, China, and other non-Western powers, seeking autonomy from U.S. influence. For Washington, such independence is often seen not as a sovereign choice but as a threat. The presence of F-35s serves as a stark reminder of how that threat is answered, not with dialogue, but with displays of force. Imagine, then, the message this sends across Latin America. Countries that attempt to chart their own course, even within their own borders, see that U.S. power can arrive in the form of stealth jets, sanctions, or political pressure. The lesson is chilling: sovereignty may be written into international law, but it is conditional when U.S. interests are at stake. The hook here is undeniable. How can any nation feel secure in its independence when the most powerful military in history asserts the right to monitor, pressure, and intervene at will? It is also worth noting that such actions often destabilize rather than secure the region. Interventionist policies have repeatedly produced political turmoil, economic hardship, and authoritarian backlashes in Latin America. When Washington claims to protect democracy, history shows it has often done the opposite, supporting dictatorships when convenient, undermining elected governments when they prove too independent. The record speaks for itself, and the deployment of advanced jets near Venezuela echoes this contradiction. Protection becomes a euphemism, a carefully chosen word that hides the continuity of intervention. For ordinary observers, the pattern becomes unmistakable once recognized. F-35s near Venezuela are not about an immediate military danger. They are about reminding the hemisphere of U.S. dominance, a dominance rationalized by the same language of security that has been used for over a century. When we connect today's maneuvers with yesterday's coups and covert operations, we see the threads of continuity, threads that reveal protection not as an objective reality, but as a political narrative. The past is not past. It lives on in every roar of an F-35's engines over the skies of Latin America. When the U.S. sends F-35s into Venezuelan skies, it is not only Latin Americans who should be concerned. The American people themselves must ask what is being sacrificed in the name of such displays of power. Each flight, each deployment, each maneuver represents not only a geopolitical signal, but also a financial commitment, one measured in billions of taxpayer dollars. And the unavoidable question arises: what are Americans getting in return for this massive expenditure? Are they truly safer, more secure, better protected? Or are their resources being diverted into global posturing while their own communities face deep vulnerabilities? The cost of the F-35 program is staggering. It is among the most expensive weapons systems in history, projected to consume over $1 trillion across its lifespan. Each jet carries a price tag in the hundreds of millions, and maintaining them requires an infrastructure that drains public coffers year after year. When such assets are deployed to hover near Venezuela, the official line is that this investment safeguards American interests. Yet if one turns to the streets of Detroit, the hospitals of rural Mississippi, or the classrooms of underfunded public schools across the nation, a very different reality becomes evident. The money poured into stealth jets has not protected Americans from medical bankruptcy, student debt, or collapsing bridges. Instead, it has prioritized geopolitical signaling over the everyday insecurities that shape citizens' lives. Here lies a piercing hook. Imagine a household where the roof leaks, the children go without adequate food, and the parents struggle to pay medical bills. Yet instead of fixing the roof or feeding the children, the family spends its savings on a flashy, high-tech security system to show the neighbors how powerful they are. Would we call that protection, or would we call it negligence? This is precisely the contradiction embedded in U.S. priorities. Protection at home, the kind that comes from healthcare infrastructure and economic stability, takes a backseat to protection abroad, defined not by people's needs but by military dominance. The irony grows deeper when one considers the rhetoric of security. Policymakers assure the public that such deployments are necessary to safeguard democracy, yet American democracy itself is fraying under the weight of inequality, polarization, and economic hardship. What good is a trillion-dollar jet program if millions of citizens cannot access affordable housing, if hospitals close in poor neighborhoods, or if climate disasters repeatedly expose the fragility of national preparedness? Security in its truest form is not measured in fighter jets, but in the resilience of a society to care for its people. By that standard, the investment in F-35s near Venezuela looks less like protection and more like misallocation on a grand scale. This trade-off is not abstract, it is visible in budget decisions. Every dollar spent on foreign deployments is a dollar not spent on domestic needs. Economists have long pointed out the opportunity cost of military spending: the bridges not repaired, the teachers not hired, the medical treatments not provided. When Washington claims that F-35s protect American citizens, one must ask, from what? Are Venezuelan jets about to bomb U.S. cities? Or is the real danger that Americans themselves are being left exposed to the far more immediate threats of poverty, illness, and environmental collapse? The narrative of protection abroad hides the absence of genuine protection at home. The deployment of F-35s near Venezuela also highlights a profound disconnect between the priorities of those in power and the realities of everyday Americans. For the political and military establishment, global dominance is equated with safety. For ordinary citizens, however, safety means being able to pay rent, afford medicine, and trust that a bridge will not collapse under their cars. These two definitions of protection exist side by side, but only one receives the lion's share of funding and attention. And as long as that imbalance persists, the very citizens funding these jets remain unprotected in the most fundamental ways. So when Americans are told that F-35s circling Venezuelan skies are necessary for their security, they must ask whose security is truly being defended. The answer becomes uncomfortable: not theirs, but that of corporate interests, political reputations, and military institutions invested in perpetuating dominance. The American people, meanwhile, are asked to pay the bill, all while enduring vulnerabilities that no fleet of jets will ever resolve. This is the hidden cost of the trade-off, the illusion of protection abroad purchased at the expense of protection at home. When the United States positions F-35s near Venezuela, it is presented to the public as a defensive maneuver, a way to preserve order in the hemisphere. But the reality is that such deployments function not as shields but as swords. They are not passive acts of protection, they are active demonstrations of force, calculated to remind adversaries and allies alike of America's military reach. To call them defense is to mislabel them, for defense implies responding to a threat, while this move creates the very tension it claims to prevent. The distinction matters, because in the realm of international politics, perception shapes reality. What one side describes as safeguarding, the other perceives as provocation, and that perception can ignite consequences far beyond what Washington intends. The F-35 is not a neutral symbol. It is the most advanced fighter jet in the world, capable of stealth operations, precision strikes, and electronic warfare. Its presence near Venezuela sends a message louder than any press statement. The United States is willing to escalate, to flex power, to show that its military technology can operate unhindered in the region. But here lies the hook. How does a country like Venezuela interpret such a deployment? For a government already wary of U.S. interference, The sudden appearance of cutting-edge stealth jets nearby cannot be seen as benign. It is a signal of intimidation, a warning cloaked in the language of defense. To Venezuela and to others watching closely, Russia, China, and neighboring states, it communicates not safety, but threat. The risk is that this so-called defense creates the very instability it claims to guard against. History shows us that military buildups near contested borders often spark escalation, not peace. During the Cold War, even small troop movements or naval deployments triggered spirals of tension that nearly led to catastrophic outcomes. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains the most striking reminder of how proximity of weapons can bring the world to the edge of nuclear war. If missiles in Cuba were a provocation then, why would stealth jets near Venezuela be anything less today? The double standard may satisfy domestic audiences, but it does not erase the dangers inherent in such provocations. For ordinary Venezuelans, the presence of these jets does nothing to enhance security. It does not fill empty grocery shelves. It does not heal political divides. It does not solve economic collapse. Instead, it heightens the sense of vulnerability as the skies above their homes become potential arenas for conflict. Protection for them would mean stability, dialogue, and respect for sovereignty. What they witness instead is a spectacle of foreign power asserting dominance in their own neighborhood. The sword, not the shield, is what cuts into their daily reality. Even for Americans, the provocation carries risks. Deployments like this invite responses from rival powers who may seek to counterbalance U.S. presence in other parts of the world. If Washington normalizes the stationing of stealth aircraft near adversaries, what is to prevent Russia from intensifying its presence near NATO borders, or China from expanding its military footprint in contested seas? Each provocation in one corner of the globe lays the groundwork for escalations elsewhere. The cycle of action and counteraction is predictable, and yet it is disguised under the language of defense. The hook is unmistakable in seeking to demonstrate strength. The United States may actually be weakening global stability. This is where the real danger lies. Protection suggests a desire to reduce risk to create safety, but provocation does the opposite. It multiplies risks, destabilizes regions, and fuels mistrust. A sword is sharp, dangerous, and always threatening to strike. The F-35s, when framed as protection, are cast in a misleading light because they do not shield anyone from harm. They remind the world that the United States is willing to wield its blade, even in situations where no immediate threat exists. That reminder may reassure policymakers in Washington, but for the people living under those skies, and for rivals watching from afar, it raises alarms rather than lowering them. Thus, the presence of F-35s near Venezuela must be understood not as a passive measure of security, but as an active signal of power. It is a message written in the language of provocation, not defense. And while that message may satisfy the desire to appear strong, it leaves behind a trail of insecurity, mistrust, and risk. The shield, when inspected closely, reveals itself to be a sword, and the sharpness of that sword cuts into the very stability it claims to preserve.